Yeah, please go.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the reception session. I'm privileged to be speaking alongside a esteemed professor, so you cover all the gaps that I leave in the presentation. I'll talk more generally about Africa in relation to the topic attended this afternoon, transnational architecture and agrarian distress. As you are all aware, because of the stalled agrarian transition on the continent, land remains key to the social reproduction of the majority of the peasantry who inhabit the countryside. Yeah. So any modifications to access and the way in which the peasantry use the land to derive returns, reduce values, participating in the markets is bound to have wider ramifications on their social reproduction. And on the continent, we've been integrated into the capitalist system since the colonial era through various modes of colonization. Semi Amin has categorized Africa into three macro regions, dividing the continent into settler colonization, where the peasantry were alienated from the land during the colonial period in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Kenya, and Namibia. Then you have non-settler states, where the peasantry were integrated into capitalism through the markets. They were exploited through the markets. The land was not physically taken, but they were exploited through various surpluses extracted through their participation in forced export commodities and so forth. Yeah. Then you have the third region, Africa of the concessions, characterized by a few plantation enclaves here and there, but the peasantry there still also retained, or Africa of where resources, the focus was on plundering natural resources. Yeah. So the peasantry have been facing severe distress since that particular period, which has been undergoing transformation due to the various changes in which the penetration of transnational capital into the countryside has been experienced across different countries. And this distress on the continent has been largely linked to ecological imperatives, that Africa is mostly a dry, arid zone and so forth. The soils are not productive and so forth. Yeah, and land tenure deficiencies. The customary tenure systems in Africa are not considered efficient enough to allocate different use of different resources, land and so forth. Then the other issue which has been emphasized relates to technological backwardness. Yeah, that we're using backward technologies that do not enable us to advance with the productivity. As you are all aware, Africa lags behind most of the regions in terms of the levels of productivity. The output that our small farmers get per hectare of land are still ranked lowest. But what has been neglected in this debate relates to what extent does the extent of land alienation affects the outcomes within the countryside in terms of social reproduction, the super exploitation of labor. Professor Chimdi here has discussed that in length in various publications. The unequal trade relations that we began discussing in the morning, the Professor Patnaik eloquently discussed how the unequal terms of trade between the imperialist centers and the periphery affects the returns that the peasantry in the periphery obtain from agricultural production. Yeah. So a variety of solutions have been proposed on how to transition from this crisis of reproduction that we've been facing on the continent, beginning with structural adjustments in the 1970s. My own country caught up, only succumbed in the 1990s, just after liberation in the 1990s. So there was a variety of economic reform packages that were proposed by the Bretton Woods institutions on how to alter the whole macroeconomic and sectoral through a variety of liberalization, trade liberalization, deregulation of labor markets and so forth. Yeah. So one of the major policy shifts that came from that, from those structural adjustment policies, relates to the shift from food self-sufficiency to food security. That African governments were advised by the Bretton Woods institutions not necessarily to keep physical stocks in terms of food, but to keep adequate reserves within the central banks in order to import as and when food shortages occur. But we've seen how short that kind of policy has been. So there's been increased dependency on food imports and aid on the continent, largely because of that shift from securing our own food within the internal markets to more depending on imports to feed our populace. So in a sense, the policy space, since the structural adjustment programs, the policy space has been shrinking. We've been largely taking cue from the policy advice of the World Bank, IMF, and Western donors. It's not uncommon across most African countries within the ministries of agriculture to find consultants units manned by consultants from abroad to proffer policy advice on how we should proceed. So more or less our states have increasingly lost the sovereignty to define the direction and the course of action. Yeah. So since 2008, when there was the food crisis, volatility of prices and shortages of food, various responses have been put in motion to try to redress the food insecurity and malnutrition, which was unraveling across much of the countryside. And one of the key solutions that has been proposed, that has been put on the table, which has further exacerbated the distress in the countryside, was the disposition that large farms are more productive, are the solution to grow more food. We have to attract more foreign direct investment to invest in agriculture. So we have this new wave of land alienation which has been proceeding across most of the former non-settler states, which did not previously experience dispossession. Our book published last year talks in detail about the experiences of the different countries, the different actors, including transnational capital, different sovereign funds, finance capital, and so forth, were involved in this new wave of alienating the peasantry from their land in alliance, of course, with the state. Yeah. So I'll briefly try to outline some of the key points that I think have been critical in transforming the countryside for the West in over the last two or so decades. Some of the points that I'll reinforce the discussion that Professor Patnaik started in the morning. Yeah. So since structural adjustment, fiscal austerity, in terms of the withdrawal of the states from intervening into the agricultural sector has been one of the key features of the agricultural policy across several states in the continent. Subsidies have been cut, credit, inputs, and so forth, which has affected access to various types of inputs that small farmers rely on for their own production. So this had some severe implications on the agricultural productivity in the countryside. And the other issue I also want to highlight, which I briefly spoke about earlier, relates to unequal trade relations. Yeah. So most of our small farmers are the North, while Africa and the rest of the developing world were advised to withdraw, to retreat from supporting agriculture, the North has retained most of the subsidies across in the EU, in the US, and so forth. So our farmers are competing against subsidized products that originate from those various jurisdictions. Yeah, the price of a product of maize landing from the US is much cheaper the cost of production is much lower compared to what is experienced by the small farmers. So the result is we experience a lot of dumping of agricultural products, which puts severe pressure on the peasantry. If I give you an example of closer to home in the Southern African region, South Africa is the conduit of penetration of most agricultural products originating from abroad through various agreements with the EU, the US, AGOA, and poultry has been one of the key products being pushed from the US. In South Africa, since South Africa has also some capacity to produce poultry, it's repackaged and permeates across the region, and the price of chicken that lands in Harare or Lusaka is much cheaper compared to what the local peasantry are able to produce. So the prices plummet, impacting on the returns. So there are those various dynamics that are also entailed in that in unequal trade relations. Then the other issue I also want to discuss relates to the outward looking of our land policies. Yeah? Our African governments, through the Bretton Woods, were advised to pursue export-led growth across a variety of sectors, mostly primary commodities. So the emphasis has been on the production of goods destined elsewhere, as the professor was eloquently articulating to us how the various mechanics of how these things operate. So we have land uses. The priority is towards export agriculture. Until recently, if I give you an example of Zimbabwe, until before the rollout of the state-led contract farming model around maize, 65% of all the bank finance was going towards tobacco. But we have a broad range of over 30 or so commodities which share the remainder of the 35%. So there is so much emphasis on at the expense of developing products that are required within the home market, within the internal market. Yeah, and these outward-looking policies are linked to a variety of global value systems. So the study Paris was talking about, which we were part of. We're looking at tobacco. So the variety of dynamics that accompany those sort of value chains that are being developed in favor, which are geared towards servicing export markets. They come with insurance companies, as they also use insurance companies to penetrate the countryside to extract surplus, in addition to the surplus being extracted by the monopolies which are involved in the value in the different value chains. So if you look at the margins, a tobacco farmer probably gets less than 1% of the ultimate end value of the final retail price of cigarettes, be it in China or the US, where China is taking the bulk of the tobacco. Yeah. So the fifth point I also want to alert you relates to the increasing concentration of the control of the different output and input markets. The big six, DuPont, Monsanto, and so forth. In my own country, they've bought up most of the seed companies. They control up to 60% of the grain seed. And the inputs are very expensive. Most of the small farmers are not able to afford those kinds of improved varieties, which are excessively priced. Yeah, I've already talked about the sixth issue. I want to talk about the increasing incorporation of the peasantries into the world's into the world markets through different value systems and so forth, with a lot of surplus extracted by the big monopoly companies. Yeah. So over this last 2 decades or so, land alienation through what has been increasingly called the scramble has been facilitated also by the indiscriminatory land tenure systems that we have on the continent under customary tenure, where it's generally perceived that land is not registered in an individual title, so it does not belong to anyone, and most of the peasantry own land on the basis of state sanction. It's not, they don't have particular rights, but the state is the owner of the radical title. Professor would discuss these things much more better than I do. Yeah. So this kind of indiscriminate system has facilitated the dispossession of the peasantry by transnational capital in an alliance with the state. And at the lower level, traditional chiefs are also involved in negotiating the dispossession of land by the peasantry. Yeah, and as you would rightly predict, women are both the brunt of this land. Before dispossession, their rights are already precarious. And their situation is further exacerbated by dispossession. So the land is being dispossessed for a variety of activities: agriculture, mining, natural resource conservation, and so forth. And it's mostly the best land with better access to water and so forth. And it's increasingly resulting in the semi-proletarianization of the dispossessed, as if they are accommodated, they work in the large farms that are being constituted in previously areas predominantly occupied by the peasantry. Yeah. So there's some of the points I thought I would mention. The responses that are being. Lastly, before I try to highlight some of the responses, then you have also philanthropic initiatives through the 2 minutes. Yeah. Okay, I'm almost done. Philanthropic initiatives through the Bill and Melinda Gates and others were also increasing time to try to come in to fill the so-called technological backwardness, but further tying the peasantry to monopoly agribusiness input companies through saying that we need to provide improved varieties to small farmers to improve their productivity, but further tying them into this exploitative relation between the peasantry and the large agrarian capital. To conclude, there have been various responses have been far and few and far between to resist this neoliberal agenda, which has been permeating across the different countries in the region. One would consider the Zimbabwean case, which implemented radical redistributive land reforms against the grain, while the rest of the continent there's been reconstitution of large farms. Zimbabwe went against the grain and redistributed, confiscated large-scale commercial farms and parceled them out to peasants. But that still remains limited due to the recapture of the peasantry, again by the monopoly capital through the control of the output and input markets within the country. The thinking has not gone much further on how to reorganize agriculture to sort of de-link and constitute a kind of autonomous development agenda to advance the countryside. Then you also have the Malawi case, the expansive subsidy program for small farmers, but that again still tied to agribusiness capital, which supplies the different inputs and extracts most of the surplus from those programs. So the resistance which is moving towards total de-link are few and far between, and we still need to think about how to build resistance and rebuild the productive forces of the peasantry for us to advance the social reproduction in the countryside. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.